I've been working as a pizza delivery driver for about 2 years now. I like the job well enough. It's not too hard, the tips are decent, and I get to drive around listening to music. Usually nothing crazy happens. Sure, sometimes people answer the door in weird costumes or there's a party going on, but it's mostly just normal stuff. It was a Friday night, and Halloween was always one of our busiest nights. People order pizzas for parties or because they're too lazy to cook after taking their kids trick-or-treating. The orders were coming in non-stop and my boss, Joe, was pushing everyone to get deliveries out as fast as possible, around 11 p.m. When things had started to slow down, an order came in from the outskirts of town. The address was for a place I'd never delivered to before. Joe handed me the pizza box. "Last one for the night, man," he said, looking relieved. "Just take it to the edge of town and you're done." I glanced at the address. The house was on a road that I barely even knew existed. It was in a part of town where most people don't live anymore. Just old, rundown houses that haven't been taken care of for years. I didn't think much of it at the time, but something about the address gave me a bad feeling. I shrugged it off, thinking I'd be back in half an hour, tops. The drive out there was quiet, too quiet. No cars on the road, no trick-or-treaters. Most of the houses were dark and the streetlights barely lit up the road. I finally found the house. It was on a dead-end street, sitting all by itself, surrounded by trees. The house looked old and kind of creepy. Paint was peeling off the siding and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. The windows were dark, but I figured they were just saving on electricity or something. I pulled up to the driveway and grabbed the pizza. When I knocked on the door, there was a long pause before it finally creaked open. The guy who answered was tall, with a scruffy beard and dark sunken eyes. He had on this dirty old sweater and jeans, and something about him made my skin crawl. But I had a job to do, so I put on my best customer service smile. "Your pizza," I said, holding out the box. The man stared at me for a second before opening the door wider. "Come inside," he said. "I need to get your payment." Now, I know we're not supposed to go inside customers' houses, it's company policy. But this guy seemed off. And something told me it would be smarter to just go along with what he wanted, at least for now. I stepped inside and immediately, I regretted it. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The walls were covered in old faded wallpaper, and the place was a mess. Furniture was all over the place, as if someone had moved in a hurry and never bothered to clean up afterward. The weirdest part, though, was the pictures on the walls. There were family photos hanging up, but in almost every single one, the faces of the woman and the kids had been scratched out. The man's face was still visible, though, grinning like a madman in every picture. Where should I put the pizza?" I asked, trying not to sound nervous. "Just leave it on the table," he said, pointing to a cluttered dining table nearby. He disappeared into another room, leaving me standing there, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. I set the pizza down and started to inch my way toward the door, hoping I could get out without him noticing. But then I heard it. A faint noise coming from the basement. It sounded like a thud, followed by some kind of dragging sound. My heart started racing. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to bolt for the door and never look back, but I also didn't want to piss this guy off. So, I stayed put, trying to act normal. After what felt like forever, the man finally came back, holding a crumpled $20 bill. He handed it to me without saying a word, his eyes locking onto mine in this way that made my stomach twist. I mumbled a quick thanks and practically sprinted to the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard the noise again, louder this time. It was definitely coming from the basement. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the man watching me, his expression unreadable. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. Is everything okay down there?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The man's face darkened, and for a second I thought he was going to lose it. But instead, he just smiled. This slow, unsettling grin that made my skin crawl. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said in a low voice. "Happy Halloween," I didn't need to be told twice. I yanked the door open and rushed out, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got back into my car, I could still feel his eyes on me, watching me through the cracked front window. I sped out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was halfway back to the pizza place. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, I was shaking. I parked and sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath and calm down. Joe was already locking up for the night when I walked inside. "You okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I gave a nervous laugh and told him about the weird house and the guy who invited me inside. As I described the place, Joe's face went pale. "Wait," he said, cutting me off. "What was the address?" I told him, and he just stared at me for a second before shaking his head. "That can't be right," he said. That house has been abandoned for years." I froze. "What do you mean?" Joe sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "There was a guy who lived there with his family like 10 years ago. On Halloween night, he snapped. Killed his wife and kids. They found the bodies in the basement all hacked up. After that, the house was condemned. No one's lived there since. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, but I was just there," I stammered. "The guy," he answered the door. "He invited me inside. I saw him." Joe shook his head again. "You couldn't have. There's no way. The place is boarded up." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I really gone to the wrong house? Was I losing it? I wanted to go back and check, but the thought of that creepy guy and the noise from the basement made me feel sick to my stomach. I quit the job a week later. I couldn't get that night out of my head, no matter how hard I tried. I even drove past the house once just to see if Joe was right. The place looked even worse in the daylight. Boarded up windows, weeds growing up through the cracks in the driveway. No signs of life. I don't know what happened that night, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never take another delivery on Halloween again. I had just gone out for drinks with a couple of friends after work. We hung out at this bar that was decorated with cheesy plastic pumpkins and fake cobwebs. You know, the usual stuff. The whole night was pretty uneventful, to be honest. We had a few beers, talked about work, and then around midnight, we decided to call it a night. The streets were still buzzing with people dressed up in costumes, laughing, being loud. It felt normal. Well, as normal as Halloween can be, I guess. My apartment is only about a 15-minute walk from the bar, so I decided to walk home. The night was cold, but not unbearable. The streets were mostly empty by the time I left, with only a few groups of drunk people wandering around. I wasn't really paying attention to much, just had my hands in my jacket pockets, staring down at the sidewalk, trying to get home and crash in bed. About halfway through my walk, I noticed something, or rather, someone. I glanced up and saw this guy walking on the opposite side of the street, maybe about 20 feet behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People are always walking around on Halloween night, right? But there was something off about this guy. He was wearing this white mask, like the kind you see in cheap horror movies, and he was just staring at me. No costume, no decorations on him. Just the mask. I figured it was probably just some weirdo trying to scare people for fun. I tried to shrug it off, but there was something unsettling about the way he was walking, almost like he was taking his time, like he wasn't in a hurry but also wasn't about to stop. I kept walking, but after a couple of minutes I glanced back again. He was still there, same distance behind, same slow, deliberate pace. I sped up a little, but the moment I did, he seemed to do the same. Not running, not even jogging, but just keeping that unnerving distance. At that point, my heart was starting to pound a little. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I was definitely on edge. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was Halloween after all. People do weird things on Halloween. But then I noticed something strange. He wasn't just keeping up with me, he was mirroring my every move. If I crossed the street, he crossed the street. If I slowed down, he slowed down. That's when the unease really started creeping in. This wasn't just some drunk guy messing around. He was following me. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe we were both going the same way, but my gut was telling me something else. I decided to take a detour. Instead of heading straight home, I turned down a side street. I figured if he kept following me, then I'd know for sure. And sure enough, when I glanced back, there he was, still trailing me. My stomach dropped. I could feel the adrenaline start to kick in. I wasn't far from my apartment, but I didn't want to lead this guy to my front door, so I made another quick turn and ducked into a small alleyway behind some buildings. I crouched down behind a dumpster, trying to catch my breath and listen. I stayed there for what felt like forever, my ears straining for any sound of footsteps. Nothing. I slowly peeked out from behind the dumpster and looked back towards the street. The guy was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I figured he had just given up and gone on to find someone else to scare. I waited a few more minutes just to be safe and then hurried out of the alley and made a beeline for my apartment. When I finally got inside, I locked the door behind me, double-checking it just to make sure. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence of my empty apartment. My heart was still racing, but I felt a little better being in the safety of my own home. I kicked off my shoes, threw my jacket on the couch, and went to the kitchen to grab a drink. It was all fine, or so I thought. About an hour passed. I was sitting on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A knock. Just a single knock at my front door. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me freeze. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was well past midnight by this point. I put my phone down and sat there for a second, listening. Maybe it was my neighbors. Maybe it was nothing. Then, another knock, this time a little louder. I stood up and walked to the door, my stomach twisting in knots. I peeked through the peephole and my heart nearly stopped. It was him. The guy in the white mask, just standing there right outside my door staring at it. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What the hell was he doing? Why was he here? I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door? Should I call the cops? My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The operator picked up and I quickly explained what was happening. She told me to stay inside, lock all the doors, and wait for the police to arrive. I hung up and went back to the door. The guy was still there, just standing, not moving, not knocking anymore. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to break in. He just stood there, staring at the door. It was the most unnerving thing I've ever experienced. I kept glancing through the peephole, expecting him to do something, anything, but he just waited. The minutes dragged on, and the police still hadn't shown up. I started to wonder if maybe I was overreacting, maybe this was some kind of prank. But then, why hadn't he left? Why hadn't he said anything? After what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens in the distance. The guy must have heard them too, because he finally moved. Slowly he turned and walked away down the hall, disappearing into the darkness. When the cops arrived, I explained everything to them, but there wasn't much they could do. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him. They told me to be careful and call if he came back, but that was about it. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I felt like he was there, somewhere, just out of sight. But as the days passed, I started to relax. Maybe it really had just been some Halloween prank, and I was overthinking it. But now, a year later, Halloween is coming up again, and I can't help but feel that same unease creeping back in. I keep glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him there, waiting. I haven't told anyone about it, mostly because I don't want to sound paranoid, but part of me wonders if he'll come back this year, if he'll knock on my door again, just to stand there in that mask, waiting for God knows what. My friends wouldn't take no for an answer. They begged me to come with them to this Halloween party at an old barn on the outskirts of town. They said it was going to be epic and that I had to be there. I finally gave in, mostly just to shut them up. The barn was about a 30-minute drive from where I lived. My friend Josh was driving and our other friends, Chris and Taylor, were in the back seat. Everyone had been talking about this party for weeks, saying it was supposed to be the best one of the year. When we arrived, I could already hear the music blasting from inside the barn. People were milling around outside, laughing and taking pictures in their costumes. It looked like something out of one of those teen horror movies. I wasn't impressed. I wasn't even dressed up. I just wore a plain hoodie and jeans, which made me stand out since everyone else was in full costume. Chris was a pirate, Taylor was dressed as a zombie, and Josh was supposed to be a vampire, but his costume was a mess with makeup smeared all over his face. They all looked ridiculous, but they didn't care. They were ready to get drunk and party. We walked into the barn and it was exactly what I expected. The place was packed, the music was way too loud, and people were already stumbling around with drinks in their hands. The inside of the barn was decorated with cheap Halloween decorations, fake cobwebs, plastic skeletons, that kind of stuff. It looked like someone had put it together in 5 minutes. I stood awkwardly by the door while my friends immediately disappeared into the crowd. I thought about just leaving and waiting in the car, but I didn't want to be the buzzkill. So I grabbed a drink from a nearby table and leaned against one of the wooden beams, trying to look like I was having a good time. That's when I saw him. There was a guy standing by the barn door not far from where I was. He wasn't dressed up like everyone else. He wore a plain black hoodie, the hood pulled up over his head, and he had his hands stuffed in his pockets. But what really caught my attention was that he wasn't moving. He wasn't dancing or drinking or talking to anyone. He was just standing there, completely still, staring at the crowd. At first, I thought maybe he was just another guy like me, someone who didn't really want to be there. But there was something off about him, the way he was just standing there, not moving, not reacting to anything going on around him. It gave me a weird feeling. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe he was just waiting for someone or taking a break from the party. I mean, I wasn't exactly being social either, so who was I to judge? But as the night went on, I kept noticing him. Every time I looked over, he was still there, standing in the same spot staring at the crowd. It was like he was watching everyone, but no one else seemed to notice him. After about an hour, my friends came back to check on me. They were already pretty drunk and trying to drag me out to dance with them. I told them I was fine and that they should go have fun without me. But I couldn't stop thinking about the guy in the hoodie. Something about him was just wrong. Then, a little later, I saw him move. It wasn't much, just a step forward, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. He was still by the door, but now he was closer to the crowd, and in his hand, he was holding something. It was hard to see in the dim light, but it looked like a knife. I froze. My first thought was that I had to be seeing things. Maybe it was just a prop or part of a costume and I was overreacting. But the way he was gripping it, the way he was standing there, I knew this wasn't some Halloween joke. I started scanning the crowd, looking for my friends. I didn't care about looking paranoid anymore. I needed to find them and get them out of there. Josh was nowhere to be seen and neither was Taylor, but I spotted Chris near the back of the barn talking to some girl. I pushed my way through the crowd and grabbed Chris by the arm. He turned around, grinning at me, clearly drunk out of his mind. "Dude, what's your problem?" he slurred. "We need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now." Chris just laughed and shook his head. "Come on, man, relax." I glanced over my shoulder and the guy in the hoodie was still standing by the door, but now he was even closer. The knife was still in his hand. "I'm serious, Chris, we need to go." Chris finally noticed the look on my face and frowned. "Why? What's going on?" I didn't have time to explain. I just grabbed his arm and started pulling him toward the exit. He tried to resist at first, but I wasn't about to let him stay there, not with that guy still standing there watching us. By some miracle, we made it to the door, and I half-dragged Chris outside. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop moving. I kept pulling Chris toward Josh's car, praying that we'd find the others and get the hell out of there. Josh and Taylor were already by the car, laughing and stumbling around like idiots. They had no idea what was going on. I pushed Chris toward them and opened the car door. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking. "What? Why?" Taylor asked, clearly confused. "I'll explain later. Just get in the car." They could see I wasn't messing around, and thankfully they didn't argue. We all piled into the car, and Josh started the engine. I glanced back toward the barn, half expecting to see the guy in the hoodie standing there. But there was no one. The crowd was still partying, completely unaware of what had almost happened. The drive home was silent. Aside from the occasional drunken rambling from Josh and Taylor, I didn't say anything about what I'd seen. I wasn't even sure they'd believe me. The next morning I checked the news, expecting to see reports of a stabbing or some kind of incident at the party, but there was nothing. No mention of the guy in the hoodie, no reports of any violence. It was like nothing had happened.